I guess I should start by saying that, up until recently, my life was what most people might call ordinary. My name is Jake, and I'm a construction foreman in a small town just outside Denver. I've been married to my wife, Amanda, for 9 years. We met in college, back when everything felt possible, and somehow, we just clicked. She was the kind of woman who could light up a room without even trying. Smart, funny, beautiful. People said we were the kind of couple others looked up to, the sort that seemed to have it all figured out. But, as they say, appearances can be deceiving. Lately, though, things had started to feel off. It wasn't like some dramatic shift happened overnight. It was more like little cracks that began to show in the foundation of what I thought was a solid marriage. Amanda was always busy these days, working late, going out with her friends, or saying she needed time to decompress. I told myself it was nothing, that work could be stressful and everyone needs space now and then. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. We used to spend our evenings talking about anything and everything. Our day, our plans for the future, even random things like which superhero movie was the best. But now, those conversations had dwindled to quick exchanges about schedules or what groceries we needed. And she had started looking at her phone a lot more. At first, I figured she was just scrolling through Instagram or texting her sister, but even that seemed to happen in a way that felt guarded. Like she'd tilt the screen away or leave the room entirely. I brushed it off as paranoia. Amanda wasn't the type of person who'd keep secrets, or at least, I didn't think she was. We had always been honest with each other, or so I believed. But the distance between us kept growing, and I found myself questioning things I never thought I'd have to. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe I was overthinking it, letting my insecurities get the better of me. After all, life can be hectic, right? People change, routines shift, and marriages go through rough patches. That's just part of the deal. Still, there were moments when I caught her looking at me like I was someone she barely recognized, someone she didn't quite know how to talk to anymore. And in those moments, it felt like the walls of our house weren't just shelter. They were closing in, keeping us locked in some unspoken tension neither of us seemed willing to address. I told myself I'd talk to her about it, clear the air and get back to the way things used to be. But deep down, I knew the conversation I was avoiding wasn't going to fix anything, not if my gut was right. It all started with a missing jacket. A small thing, really. Amanda had borrowed one of my sweatshirts, a gray one she always said was her favorite, before heading out to meet friends a few weeks back. When she came home that night, I didn't think much of it, but the sweatshirt never made its way back into the closet. I asked her about it once or twice, and she brushed it off, saying she must have left it in her car or at work. But for some reason, I couldn't let it go. A few days later, I went to grab her keys from the bowl by the front door. She was at the grocery store, and I figured I'd check her car myself. No sweatshirt. Instead, I found a receipt tucked into the side pocket of the passenger door. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about something like that, but this one caught my eye. It wasn't from a grocery store or a gas station. It was from a restaurant, an expensive steakhouse downtown. The date on the receipt didn't match any night I remembered us going out. It was from the same evening she'd said she was at a friend's house watching some reality show I never cared for. My stomach twisted as I stared at the slip of paper. It wasn't solid proof of anything, but it planted a seed of doubt I couldn't ignore. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. There could have been an explanation, something simple I was missing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind wouldn't stop spinning through every possibility. Was I imagining things? Was I being ridiculous? Or was there something Amanda wasn't telling me? The next morning, while she was in the shower, I did something I never thought I'd do. I picked up her phone. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I wasn't proud of myself, and I knew this was crossing a line, but I couldn't stop. Her texts didn't reveal much at first, just the usual chatter with friends and coworkers. But then I saw a name I didn't recognize, Matt. I clicked on the thread, my chest tightening with every swipe. It started out innocently enough. A few messages about work, plans to meet up for coffee, jokes that didn't mean much on the surface. But as I kept scrolling, the tone shifted. Their conversations became more personal, more intimate. He made her laugh in ways I hadn't seen in months. And then, there it was, a message from her that stopped me cold. Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me, like the air had been sucked out of the room. My first instinct was to throw her phone across the room, but I just stood there, frozen, unable to process what I'd just read. When she came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, she smiled at me like nothing had happened. "Morning," she said casually, reaching for her coffee. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and handed her phone back, pretending I'd never touched it. For the rest of the day, I went through the motions like a robot, every interaction between us tainted by the weight of what I'd discovered. Amanda didn't seem to notice, or maybe she was too distracted to care. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't unsee those messages. I tried to think of an explanation, a reason why this wasn't what it seemed. Maybe it was a misunderstanding, a joke taken out of context. But deep down, I knew better. The cracks in our marriage weren't just cracks anymore. They were fractures, spreading wider with every passing second. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how I had missed the signs. Or maybe I hadn't. Maybe I just didn't want to see them. By the time I decided to confront Amanda, I had replayed every possible scenario in my head 100 times. I thought about doing it calmly, trying to keep my emotions in check, but the anger was bubbling beneath the surface, impossible to ignore. A part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, while another part dreaded hearing the truth. It was a Friday evening, and she'd just come home from work. She looked exhausted, tossing her bag onto the couch before heading into the kitchen. I followed her, standing in the doorway as she poured herself a glass of wine. "Can we talk?" My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but there was no turning back now. She glanced up, surprised by the seriousness in my tone. "Of course. What's up?" I hesitated for a moment, then said, "Who's Matt?" The name hung in the air like a grenade waiting to explode. Her hand froze mid-air, the glass of wine still inches from her lips. For a second, she looked genuinely confused, but then her expression shifted. Something between panic and guilt flashed across her face. "Why are you asking about Matt?" she said, setting the glass down carefully. Her voice was calm, but her eyes darted around like she was searching for an escape route. "I found the texts," I said, my words coming out harsher than I intended. "I know about the dinners, the whatever it is you've been doing with him." She stared at me, her mouth opening slightly as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. The silence was unbearable, stretching longer with every passing second. Finally, she exhaled and said, "It's not what you think." She described the connection as something unimportant, claiming it had started innocently and spiraled before she even realized what was happening. As she spoke, there was a trembling in her voice, as if she didn't quite believe her own words. She went on to explain how distant she had been feeling, how loneliness had crept in unnoticed, making her vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. Hearing her describe this so matter-of-factly only deepened the sting. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the realization that the distance she spoke of had grown right under my nose, while I was too busy convincing myself everything was fine. The more she tried to explain, the more frustrated I became. She insisted that nothing physical had happened, that it had never gone that far. But every word felt like it fell short of addressing the larger issue. She admitted to crossing lines, but stopped short of fully owning the weight of her actions. The word lonely was the hardest to hear. It carried an unspoken blame, as though I had failed to be enough, even though I had been struggling with the same feelings. For a moment, I almost wanted to argue, to tell her how I had also felt isolated, how I had been holding on to what I thought we still had while she was looking elsewhere. But the words wouldn't come. I could only turn away, my thoughts racing with too many emotions to process. The Amanda I thought I knew seemed to dissolve before my eyes, replaced by someone who felt like a stranger. The night that followed was quiet, almost unbearably so. I stayed in the living room, staring at the ceiling as questions swirled in my mind. Questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. She tried to explain herself further, but I could barely bring myself to listen. The gap between us, which had once seemed invisible, now felt insurmountable. What was I supposed to do with this? Could trust be rebuilt after something like this? Was I even willing to try? It was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The confrontation had broken something open, and there was no putting it back together the way it had been. The days stretched into weeks, and a strange quiet settled over our house. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet you'd savor. It was heavy, tense, and suffocating. Amanda and I moved through the same rooms, but it felt like we were miles apart. She'd still cook dinner most nights, leaving a plate for me on the counter, but I'd eat it alone in the living room, staring blankly at whatever was on TV. The silence between us wasn't just uncomfortable, it was crushing. Every time I caught a glimpse of her, I'd feel the sting of betrayal all over again. It was in the smallest things, like the way she looked at her phone less often now, or how she avoided eye contact when passing me in the hallway. She was trying, I could see that, but it didn't feel like enough. In the quiet moments when she thought I wasn't looking, I'd catch her staring at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Sadness? Maybe both. One night, as I sat on the couch, flipping through channels without really watching anything, Amanda approached cautiously. She lingered near the doorway, like she wasn't sure if she should come closer. "I made some tea," she said softly, holding a steaming mug in her hands. I glanced at her but said nothing. She set the mug down on the coffee table and hovered there for a moment before retreating back to the kitchen. That small act, the tea, the way she lingered, should have meant something, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. The wall between us felt too high, too solid, and I wasn't ready to tear it down. I started spending more time out of the house. After work, I'd drive aimlessly through the city, sometimes parking in empty lots just to sit and think. One evening, I found myself parked at the edge of a park we used to visit when we were first dating. I remembered the time Amanda had convinced me to rent one of those tandem bikes, even though I told her it was a terrible idea. We'd spent more time laughing and wobbling than actually riding, but it had been one of those perfect days you never forget. The memory hit me hard, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, trying to fight back the lump in my throat. How had we gone from that to this? I couldn't keep it all bottled up anymore. That night, I called Eric. My older brother had always been the one I turned to when things got tough. He was the kind of guy who didn't sugarcoat anything, but he also had a way of making you feel like you could handle whatever life threw at you. I told him everything, about the texts, the confrontation, and the unbearable silence that had taken over my life. For a while, he didn't say anything, just let me get it all out. When I finally finished, he let out a long sigh. "Man, that's rough," he said. "I wish I could tell you there's a clear answer, but there isn't. What I can tell you is this: you've got to figure out what you need, not just what she wants or what other people think you should do. What do you want, Jake? What can you live with?" His words stuck with me long after the call ended. What did I want? The truth was, I didn't know. Part of me wanted to rewind time, to go back to before any of this happened. But another part of me, the part that kept replaying those texts in my head, knew things could never go back to the way they were. The following weekend, Amanda tried again to reach out. She suggested we go for a drive together, maybe stop at that little diner we used to love. I agreed, mostly because I didn't have the energy to say no, but the car ride was tense. The radio played softly in the background, filling the silence we couldn't. At the diner, she tried to make conversation, asking me about work, about the guys I hung out with. I answered in short, clipped sentences, unable to summon the warmth I used to have for her. When the food arrived, she finally said what I think she'd been holding back the whole time. "Jake," she started, her voice barely above a whisper, "I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face thinner than I remembered. She looked like she'd been carrying the weight of the world, and I wondered if I looked the same. But even as she said the words, I felt a pang of doubt. Could we fix this? Did I even want to? For the rest of the evening, we sat in that diner, talking about everything except what mattered most. It felt like a fragile truce, one that could shatter at any moment. Later that night, as I lay awake on the couch, staring at the dark ceiling, Eric's words came back to me. "What do you want, Jake?" I didn't have the answer yet, but I knew I couldn't keep living in limbo. Something had to give. The fragile truce Amanda and I had formed after that night at the diner didn't last long. It wasn't anything dramatic that broke it. No shouting, no new revelations. Just the steady erosion of what little trust we had left. Every interaction between us felt like a balancing act, teetering on the edge of collapse. One evening, I came home late after staying at the gym longer than usual. Working out had become my escape, the only place where I could drown out the noise in my head. When I walked through the front door, the house was eerily quiet, except for the faint sound of music coming from the living room. Amanda was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring blankly at the television. She didn't even look up when I walked in. I paused, watching her for a moment, wondering if I should say something or just head to the bedroom. Before I could decide, she spoke. "Jake," she said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made my chest tighten. "We can't keep going on like this." I stayed where I was, my bag still slung over my shoulder. "What do you mean?" She turned to look at me then, her face pale and her eyes tired. This isn't a marriage anymore. We're just two people sharing the same space, pretending everything's fine when it's not." I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong. Amanda stood up and took a few tentative steps toward me. "I know I hurt you, and I know I can't take that back, no matter how much I want to. But I can't keep living like this, walking on eggshells, waiting for you to forgive me, or for you to decide you can't." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her that I was trying, that I wanted to forgive her, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure if I could. "I don't know what you want me to say," I finally admitted, setting my bag down. "You think this is easy for me? Every time I look at you, all I can think about is him. About the texts, about how you lied to me. How am I supposed to move past that?" She flinched, like my words had physically hurt her. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this. But I can't do it alone, Jake. I need you to meet me halfway. If you can't, if you don't want to," she trailed off, her voice breaking. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me, suffocating me. "I need time," I said finally, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. Amanda nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. She didn't try to argue or plead with me. She just turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling more lost than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't seem to control. Memories of our life together played on a loop in my head. The good times, the bad, and everything in between. I thought about the first time I saw her, sitting at that little coffee shop with her nose buried in a book. I thought about our wedding day, how beautiful she looked walking down the aisle, and how I'd promised to love her no matter what. But I also thought about the texts, the dinners, the lies. By the time the sun started to rise, I still didn't have any answers. All I knew was that something had to change. The morning after that sleepless night, I woke up with a heaviness that felt unbearable. Amanda had already left the house, her absence a quiet reminder of the fragile state of our relationship. The house felt impossibly still, as if the weight of everything unsaid was pressing down on the walls. I decided to clear my head and drove out to a hiking trail I hadn't been to in years. It was the kind of place I used to go before life became so complicated. A spot where I could just walk, surrounded by nothing but trees and the sound of my own footsteps. As I climbed the familiar path, my mind wandered. I thought about everything Amanda had said the night before and everything I hadn't been able to say in return. Somewhere along the way, I realized I'd been avoiding the truth, not just about Amanda, but about myself. The reality was, her actions had broken something in me, but our marriage hadn't started to crack the moment I found those texts. The cracks had been there long before, invisible but spreading, as we both let the distance between us grow. Her loneliness wasn't an excuse, but it wasn't something I could ignore either. I hadn't been the husband I thought I was. I sat down on a large rock overlooking the valley, staring out at the horizon as the early morning light turned the sky shades of orange and pink. For the first time in weeks, my anger didn't feel so sharp. In its place was a deep, aching sadness, but also the faintest flicker of clarity. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't about erasing what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. It was about deciding whether I wanted to hold on to the pain or let it go. When I got back home, Amanda was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, her expression guarded, like she was bracing for whatever I was about to say. I sat down across from her and took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," I said, the words coming slower than I expected. "About us. About everything." Her eyes searched mine, but she didn't say anything. "I'm not ready to give up on this," I admitted. "But I can't do it alone. And I can't do it if we're both still holding on to everything that's happened. If we're going to move forward, we have to really try. Both of us." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I want to try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try." We sat there for what felt like hours, talking for the first time in months, not just about the affair, but about the things we'd both been too afraid to say. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty, but it felt real. Over the next few weeks, we started counseling together, something we probably should have done years ago. It wasn't a magic fix. It didn't erase the pain or the doubts, but it gave us a place to start. There were still moments when the hurt would resurface, sharp and sudden, but they didn't linger as long as they used to. Slowly, I began to see Amanda not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as the person I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. A person who had made a terrible mistake but was trying to make things right. I don't know what the future holds for us. I don't know if our marriage will ever feel the same again. But I do know that holding on to the past won't change it, and clinging to anger will only hurt us both. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that love isn't always enough on its own. It takes effort, patience, and a willingness to face the hard truths about yourself and the person you've chosen to spend your life with. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to give us a chance.